Hey, Becky.
Hi, Dan.
Hey, how are you doing today?
I'm doing great. How are you doing today?
Yeah, doing well. I didn't have a chance to connect with you too much before jumping on, but we're excited for another webinar today. And yeah, again, I'm Dan. This is Becky. We're two people, two members of the team here at Mile, and excited to do another educational webinar. So if you want more information about Mile, you can visit milestrong.com and look at everything about us as a business. But we're, in a nutshell, we're the only private high intensity strength training that you can perform in business clothes, 20 minutes twice a week with minimal risk of injury, with thoughtful precision and individual care. Our goal is to come alongside you and anyone else who wants to engage in strength training and in life in this unique way. And so we have in-studio locations, and we also have online platform called Mile Pivot that you can engage in. And we'd love to connect with you there. And basically, our goal is to come alongside people, build them up so that they can build others up and live life fully. So again, if you want more information, check out milestrong.com. But today we're going to hit on two kind of really important topics as we think about strength training. And there are a whole number of benefits that come in as consequences of strength training and the way that we approach strength training and exercise. And ultimately, our goal, as we've talked about in weeks past, exercise being the goal of exercise is really to stimulate your body to produce a response and a system and engage a system that is naturally working as we engage it in this way. And so it's something that we get to work alongside our body with, not against our body. And then we have to give it time to let the body do what it's been designed to do. And when we do that well and efficiently, we can enjoy a lot of aspects of life, but then also enjoy a lot of aspects that come through strength training. And so last week, if you didn't have a chance to check it out, we talked a little bit about exercise versus recreation and really distinguishing between those two. And there's a lot of really interesting thoughts as you distinguish between exercise and recreation. And so just encourage you to check out last week's or previous weeks on exercise or goal setting or things like that. But today we're going to spend some specific time looking at insulin sensitivity in relation to strength training and what happens in the body as we engage in strength training at a high intensity level like we do here at Mile. And then also as another benefit, fat loss being a part of what the body begins to do as a natural consequence of high intensity strength training. So Becky, I don't know if there's anything you wanted to add into that, but would love to have you kick us off talking a little bit about insulin sensitivity as it affects so many of our clients and people that come to us that are interested in strength training for a variety of reasons, but then they learn a little bit more about some of these things and then are more excited about really strength training in this manner.
All right, that was a great intro. Thanks, Dan. Well, in talking about insulin sensitivity and fat loss, it reminds me that our bodies are incredibly and beautifully designed by our creator. And these processes that we're talking about are very complex. And and I'm not a medical professional. Dan isn't a medical professional, but we want to give you kind of in a nutshell, in layman's terms, what's the basis of what's going on in these very complex processes. And so if you want to learn more about what we're talking about, we encourage you to look at the book Body by Science. And this is written by Doug McGuff, who is a physician, as well as John Little. So this is a great resource. If what we're talking about is really intriguing to you and you really want to get into the very detailed systems about these two topics, this is a great resource to start with. Mm-hmm. So insulin sensitivity, like we've talked about before, we want to define our terms. So let's first of all talk about what is insulin. Insulin is a hormone that's produced by the pancreas, and it has two functions. It drives nutrition storage, and it also stabilizes our blood sugar levels. And glucose. So glucose is a simple sugar that our bodies use to produce energy. Now, insulin binds the receptors to the surface of the cells of a muscle of our cells, for instance, muscle cells. and that they move glucose from the bloodstream into the cell. So just to serve as an example, here's this little poof, okay, these little body poof that you use for the shower. We're going to pretend that this is a cell, a muscle cell, okay? And on the surface of this cell are receptors. And that's what I was referring to, that the insulin binds to these receptors and allows glucose to travel from the bloodstream into this cell. Now, when the glucose levels in our blood are low, what happens is there's space within this cell for glucose to be entered. And so the receptors on the outside of the cell are very sensitive to insulin circulating through the system. And that's what we want. We want those receptors to stay very sensitive. Now, what happens is as glucose levels rise, the cells can take in more and more glucose into the cells. And eventually what happens is the cell becomes full. And those long chain glucose molecules pack together really tightly like this structure is here, and they become glycogen. So they're packed in and it becomes full. And so what happens is that those receptors on the surface of the cell become less sensitive because they can't take any more glucose into the cell, it's full. So as more glucose is traveling through the bloodstream, it encounters these cells, and these receptors again become more or less sensitive to that glucose traveling through. Now, because of this excess glucose traveling through the system, the pancreas produces more insulin to metabolize that. And what happens is high levels of insulin are very inflammatory. So this cell wall becomes inflamed. And then what the body does is the liver produces LDL cholesterol to address those levels of inflammation. It's like almost like a sticky substance. Now, as if you remember, LDL cholesterol is that bad cholesterol. You don't want that number high. But because of this inflammation that's going on the cell wall, your liver is producing more of that to address these inflammation issues, and that puts you at higher risk for cardiovascular problems. So what does this have to do with strength training? Well, the other thing I want to mention too is when glucose levels are high and there's no place to store them, they get transferred into fat, which is what Dan is going to be talking about later. But how does high intensity exercise help with this process? Well, high intensity exercise taps into the largest stores of energy of glucose in these muscle cells. So the higher the level of intensity, the more drainage that actually happens out of these cells. So think of it like this: when you're working out in a high intensity level, these cells are actually getting squeezed, and the stored energy that's in here is released into the bloodstream to help you engage in that activity. A low level activity, such as a steady state activity like walking or jogging, will squeeze this just a little bit. Now, the deeper the level of drainage of the cell, the longer it takes to replenish that cell. And it can take up to several days if the drainage is really extensive. The good thing is that those receptors that we talked about that are on the surface of the cell help with that replenishing process. So this activity of having these these cells restored and full of glycogen, and then having it released on a regular basis, keep those sensors on the cell wall really sensitive. So that's a very good thing. And so that is kind of in a nutshell what insulin sensitivity is and how high intensity strength training helps that. Now at Mayo, that is what we specialize in. We, as Dan mentioned, 20-minute workouts 1 or 2 times a week. These are not something these are not easy workouts. They're high intensity. And so what's happening is you're tapping into your muscle stores of energy and doing what your body is designed to do. And you'll see those results in fat loss, lower cholesterol. People have reported lower blood pressure, and insulin sensitivity is a part of that. Now, as you know, insulin sensitivity is a problem within our culture. There's a lot of people that become diabetic as they get older, and that's a really serious condition. There's a lot of complications that come along with being a diabetic. And so we are happy that this process of high intensity strength training can help address that very critical problem within our country. So, any questions that you have, Dan, on anything that I discussed or?
No, that was good, Becky. I appreciate even the imagery, being able to just in a simple way kind of talk about what's happening on a cellular level throughout all the cells of the body, especially within the muscle tissues. That's obviously what we're really engaging. Do you have any personal connections to some of I mean, I know we talk a lot about it with different clients and members of Myo, but are there any connections or personal engagements or even family or clients that you've seen that have had significant change just as you've conversed about some of these different things within insulin and insulin sensitivity and that sort of stuff?
Mhm. Well, there's a client that had been coming in for a number of years, and she developed diabetes, and I was able to take the Body by Science book. I gave this book to her and asked her to bring that into the medical professional that she sees on a regular basis, so that she can have a better conversation about what happens on a metabolic level when she
Mm.
engages in high intensity exercise. And they were both very encouraged by what they read through this book, especially with the credentials of Doug McGuff being a physician. So that was really exciting. And
Yeah.
the second thing is we have a current client who has um, been struggling with diabetes for a number of years and actually lost a lot of weight and has been doing really well with managing the diabetic condition, and actually is off all medication now.
Wow.
We that and I don't he's been very diligent in a combination of activities, but it's great to see that the high intensity strength training was a component of that, and he's
Yeah.
much healthier now, and we're grateful, we're really thankful.
Wow. Yeah. That's amazing. Becky, what when you talk about some of these things, there's a whole area. We talk about strength training, but there's a whole area of really how we care for our bodies that's in relation to food. And I'm wondering just some of the connections, if you can branch some connections between food intake and some of what you're talking about, insulin and insulin sensitivity, just in a really like simple way, or maybe there's an experience you have with that.
Mhm.
You know,
So back to that initial definition I gave about glucose is a simple sugar that our bodies use to produce energy. When we think of what we consume, that's carbohydrates. Those are simple sugars. And so when you think about what you're consuming, be aware of using complex versus carbohydrates versus simple carbohydrates. So sugar, white flour, fruit
Mm,
juices can be very high. Those are very high carbohydrate foods and beverages. So it's best to have something that's more of a whole grain that takes your body a longer time to process to keep those spikes from
mm,
happening in your blood sugar. I struggle. I've not struggled with, but I've needed to manage hypoglycemia throughout my life, which is low blood sugar. And so I've discovered that if I have something that is very sugary and will cause my blood sugar to spike, I get a pretty dramatic drop
mm.
afterwards. So I've learned over the years to be careful of what I eat and how to eat, and even the timing and the combination of foods. That makes a big difference.
Yeah, yeah. Well, food, like you said, I mean, some of the imagery that I love to think about is because people are often looking at results. What kind of results will I get from strength training with Myo or doing it on my own? And they're often thinking about numbers and metrics and muscular size maybe, or physique, or fat loss or weight loss in general. And it's interesting when you think about like a car and an automobile. The imagery I like to think about is you have regular fuel vehicles and you have diesel fuel vehicles. And if you put the opposite fuel into the vehicle than is required, it just won't function well, and or at all. and so on some level, when you think about the effects and really what we're wanting from a strength training or exercise standpoint, a huge part of that is what we put into our body taps into exactly what you're talking about with within the systems of our body and how our body's receiving that nutrients and that food, digesting it and then utilizing it. And when we neglect it and we eat non-nutrient beneficial foods, or nutrient dense foods, then we're actually not helping our body and the systems of our body do what they're designed to do. And so I appreciate you sharing that, and even some of the connections personally. And I think that kind of brings into this big topic of fat loss. And feel free to jump in, because there's so much here too, Becky, that we could take webinars after webinar after webinar talking specifically about this topic. So we're not going to dive into all of that today, and maybe there'll be some sessions in the future where we can hit very specific things. But every person's body, there's general things that are happening in the systems of our body, but our bodies are very different, and we respond to things differently too. And so there are diets galore, thousands of diets you can go on. And one person will have great success. They'll write a book about it and they'll sell it to a bunch of people. And then inevitably some will be like, this is great. And others will say that didn't work for me at all. And so when you think about fat loss, that's a huge, one of the main reasons that people come in and have consultations with us. They want an experience of what myo is. At the same time, it's like, can you help me lose weight? And usually it ends up looking like that. I want to lose some weight. And one of the things that we talk about is wanting to be really discriminate in the weight that we lose. We don't want to just lose any kind of weight. We want to be able to lose fat weight, right? And then there's a whole image piece. So I think that there's like a couple of different reasons that people come in. Some of it's really health related, like I am obese or I'm heavily overweight. And another aspect is like, I just want to look better. I want to feel better. I want to have this sort of physique or whatever. And so there's kind of different reasons that people engage with strength training with the hopes of losing weight. There's been studies done for a long time now on the number of people that are overweight and obese, and it's it's grown markedly. Like in 1990, I think it was about 15% people were overweight or obese in the US. And now it's upwards of 30% obesity. And at least some of the stuff that I've been looking at, I mean, you can probably pull numbers from all kinds of stuff, but we're talking about 2/3 of people that are overweight or obese, which is just a massive, a number of people that are affected by some of the systems that you're talking about. But even some of the, I think, good intentions, but messages that have been sent that are like, you know what, low fat diets or just certain diets that people should do, and on some level they're able to sell their product more effectively or whatever else, but it's really been to the detriment of people, along with fast food and not having to actually be active all that much to sustain life. Like in the early 1900s, 1800s, so on and so forth, like you had to be really active. And so your body was engaging in some of these systems throughout the day. And now it's like I can sit at the computer and literally not do anything, especially in this, COVID 19 sort of time period that we're in and season that we're in. We actually find ourselves maybe less moving less often. But we just want to look today a little bit as well when we think about fat loss is what happens in the body. Building on what some of Becky was already talking about, before hitting into that, wanted to talk briefly about steady state activity in the 1970s and 60s, 70s, 80s. Some of the steady state activity began to be huge. There began to be a huge push, and termed cardio or termed aerobic, exercise, that sort of thing, and so they ended up doing. They ended up pushing this a lot. Like, you just need to be active. You need to be running a lot. You need to be doing these different activities, especially like post-war. There was a couple of people that were really prominent in really challenging the status quo and saying we need to be more active to lose weight, so on and so forth. And so they made this huge push and sort of to change the culture and the the thought process of our culture around exercise, not necessarily looking specifically and scientifically about what's happening, but more so just kind of going with this bandwagon of cardio activity. And some of the challenge within steady state activity is it demands a lot of time, and there's a level of stimulation that happens that produces some growth, but how much time does it take at such a low rate? We talked a little bit a couple weeks ago about intensity and the inverse relationship between intensity and exercise, or intensity and, forgive me, what am I missing here, Becky?
Volume.
Volume. There you go. Thank you. And so check that out. But as we engage in high volume and low intensity, we actually engage the body slightly differently, and it's not engaging the systems of the body as effectively in regard to fat loss, insulin sensitivity, cardiovascular efficiency, some of those types of things. Not to mention, when if you're thinking about 2/3 of the people are overweight, maybe going for a jog or doing something like that we think we need to do now actually is really dangerous and really risky on joints and bones, ligaments, like all these things that shouldn't be enduring that kind of force. And so we just want to be, within Myo, we talk a lot about safety and being really effective, really efficient, and really safe. We want to find the modality that is most safe for people to engage in, to stimulate the body in the most effective way in a minimal amount of time, so that, like we said last week, you can do the things that you love to do for as long as you can and not be limited by the perceived need of getting out and exercising more and that sort of thing. So if you want to look a little bit more into fat loss in regards to strength training, the book that Becky mentioned is a great book and has been a premier book for fat loss. So Body by Science, by two men, Little and McGuff. And there's a whole bunch of information there that we encourage you in. There's been many different studies online that you can access online. McMaster's University has done a lot of studies and scientific research behind intensity, volume, fat loss. And so we just encourage you to look into those. But ultimately, as you think about fat loss, building off what Becky was saying, is there's glycogen, which is stored glucose in the cells, and we engage the body in a really slow movement pattern. That's glycogen really in the muscle tissue is for sort of emergency situations. So it's going to tap into that immediately as soon as it's needed, flight or fight type reactions and responses. And so that's what the body initially engages in. And then from there, it can move into glucose in the bloodstream and cellular level, all those types of things. So it's going to pull from the glycogen in the muscle storage first to create energy to do the activities that we're doing. So in regards to strength trainings against some of the machines, or myopivot at home using body resistance type exercises. So as the glycogen is pulled from the muscle and used to make energy, there's a push of glycogen and glucose into the muscle tissue on a cellular level to continue to produce ATP, which is energy, and molecular size energy, if you will, and so it pulls in more glucose and more glycogen to restore, to build up. And so what we're doing in strength training is really depleting the body of glucose and glycogen storage and making room for more, which is some of what Becky was talking about. But one of the unique things is in relation to food, as you think about engaging the body and wanting to maybe have greater amounts of fat loss, we want to stimulate a hormone, which is called hormone sensitive lipase, which ends up pulling from fat storage, and it releases these fats. It breaks down these fat molecules into long chain fatty acids that then can be broken down into smaller levels and brought into the mitochondria, which is the energy producing organelle of the cell. And so it's breaking down these fats and producing energy out of them. Now, there's a whole lot of information. I'm just trying to determine maybe what's most helpful in this small sort of webinar, but essentially, if you have less glucose in your cells, in your bloodstream, available to make energy, your body begins to use this hormone to release fatty acids and release the fat, and kind of attack the fat of your body to break it down into simple form to be used as energy. And so the more that your body can be doing that, and not utilizing food that you've recently digested, sugar and glucose in the bloodstream, the more ability that you'll have to see fat reduction. And so there's different ways that you can kind of engage the system as you think about like our eating cycle and windows. One of the things that a lot of people have gotten into recently has been intermittent fasting, and there's a variety of ways to do that. But some of basically in premise, there's a portion of time where you eat and feed your body and bring in nutrient dense foods to be utilized. And then there's a time period of the day where we don't want to be having those systems of the digestive system working. Rather, we want it to be pulling from the stored areas of your body to produce energy to function. And so in the morning hours is when you're most likely to see that system at its greatest capacity working. And so if we can sort of delay eating in the morning, could be early morning, like 4 a.m. on from there. So it's not like you have to wait till noon necessarily, depending upon your body. But the more that your body can hover in that fasting period, the more it can begin attacking these fat stores for energy, because there's no longer any energy in the cells, in the bloodstream, and glucose in the bloodstream and in the cells. So kind of in brief, that strength training at a high intensity level strips the body of glycogen and glucose storage, making room for more. And if there's not more in the bloodstream, glucose and otherwise, it ends up engaging the other places of the body and begins reducing that. Now, thinking about this, and I'll let you chime in, Becky, if there's one or two things you want to talk about here in a moment too. But and I'm just forgetting what it was I was going to say. I don't know, was there any thoughts you have? It'll come back to me in a moment.
Sure. When you're talking about diets and that are out there saying, okay, eat this and you're going to lose fat from your waist, for instance, or there's certain areas that are targeted, and that's not true. Like you said, our bodies are all different, and so where you store fat as an individual is genetic. There's all kinds of factors with that, and so by engaging in a diet or a certain type of exercise to target a certain area to lose fat, is that doesn't go along with the way our bodies were designed.
Yeah.
And so the best thing is to build muscle, and along with that, like we talked about, the fat will go away.
Yeah.
You're balancing it well with your diet.
Yeah, Becky, you read my mind, so thank you. That was literally what I was trying to say. But we have a lot of people that come in and say, I want to reduce fat in this area, and spot reduction just isn't how the system works, like you were saying. So we can build that muscle in that area, which has the visual appearance of fat loss, right? The other side is actually we want to engage in our body losing fat in different areas. The thing to keep in mind is, like you said, maybe it starts in maybe for you, it starts in your belly, right? Or in your buttocks, or in your low back. And then it moves on to your arms, and then it moves on to your chest, or so on and so forth. And so when we engage the body in this way, we have to keep in mind that it's going to work in the reverse manner. And so maybe the area that you want to see reduced is your underarm, but that's actually the third area that your muscle brings fat to be stored, or your body brings fat to be stored. But we need to engage the first two areas before we'll see targeted loss of fat in that area. But like you said, Becky, as we build strength in that area, then it will kind of have this expanding of the fat storage, if you will, moving it away so it doesn't feel quite as fatty, and it also has a look and a feel of less fat, which is I think a lot of times what people are looking for, They're just looking for, how do I look? How do I feel? And that ultimately gets back to like really our desire to help people live healthy lives so that they can engage in life, in a full manner. So spot reduction, not true.
No.
And yeah, that's good. Was there any other things, Becky, you were thinking about?
When you were talking about we're talking about spot reduction and diets, I had a chuckle because when I was maybe about 8 or 9 years old, there was a family friend who had struggled with her weight her whole life as a teenager and an adult, and she was probably in her early 40s, and she said she found this diet that was going to help her lose weight, and the diet there was no exercise involved, but the diet would target, because of the combination of foods you ate, would target fat stores within your body. So it would start from the top of your head to go down to your toes. And so I just, in my mind, had this picture of where would the fat, how would this transition look? So when you're thin here, and then it got thinner and thinner, it just was such a strange concept. So eventually you're going to have really skinny upper body and a really heavy lower. It just gave me such a weird visual in my 8-year-old mind.
Totally. That's so great. Well, as you were just talking about fat too, I think just kind of want to hit on one area that's really important. When you think about nutrient dense foods, one of the things that we've been taught and told is that we want to have low fat diets in general, but there's so many beneficial things for having healthy animal fats that, you're talking about energy storage. Actually, fats break down into nearly double the amount of energy that it can produce compared to a carbohydrate or a protein. And so if you're looking for greater energy, actually engage in the systems of your body and letting them target ingested fat, digesting fat, actually can produce more energy. It's more satiating. So you eat high fat and high dense foods rather than high carbohydrate foods. Your body actually will desire less and not feel the need to eat more and more and more. And so that's a positive benefit that comes out of just being conscientious of the food that you're bringing in, and how nutrient dense it is, and how beneficial for your body it is. So it's just an extra thought. That's a whole nother topic, and my mind's going in a few other directions right now that we could go down, but I think we'll stop there. Was there any last comments you had, Becky?
That was it. Again, if you want more information about this very fascinating and very complex subject, check out the Body by Science book by McGuff and Little. And again, if you have any questions, you can contact us at milestrong.com.
Awesome. So we just want to build you up. We want to build people up so that you can build others up and live life fully. So bless you today. And we look forward to next week and talking a little bit more and hearing a little bit more about strength training and the positive effects on our body that it brings. See you, Becky.
All right. See you, Dan.